A fateful encounter. Grace had always felt out of place in large crowds, especially at events like these. The conference hall was teeming with educators and professionals from all across the state, all eager to exchange ideas, discuss innovations, and learn from one another. The air hummed with anticipation, the sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the corners as the crowd moved with purpose. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure of their place in the world, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was still finding hers. Her name tag felt too tight around her neck, and her hands were cool as she gripped the brochure. She had been planning to attend this conference for months, hoping it would help her become a better educator, maybe even inspire her to take the next step in her career. But now, standing on the threshold of the main hall, she felt a surge of uncertainty. What if no one wanted to talk to her? What if she had nothing to offer? Taking a steadying breath, she pushed through the heavy doors and entered. The room was vast, filled with rows of tables, posters showcasing new educational tools, and clusters of people chatting and networking. For a moment, she hesitated at the entrance, unsure of where to begin. Should she head straight for the workshops, or was it better to mingle and try to make connections? She'd always preferred one-on-one conversations over large group discussions, but here, she was completely alone. Her mind raced with possibilities, but before she could overthink it any longer, she saw him. Near the refreshment table, standing with his back to the crowd, was a man with striking features. He was tall, at least several inches above her 5'5", and his posture was relaxed yet confident. His dark skin gleamed under the conference lighting, and his clothes were simple but sharp. He was studying the conference program in his hands with such intensity that Grace couldn't help but be drawn to him. There was something about him, an unspoken energy that seemed to resonate with her, a quiet calm in the midst of the chaos around them. Grace took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. Her mind urged her to turn away, to leave him be, but her feet wouldn't move. She wasn't sure what drew her to him. Perhaps it was his focus or the gentle aura of kindness that seemed to surround him. But she found herself walking toward him before she even realized what she was doing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear, trying not to sound too nervous. "Is this your first time at the conference too?" The man looked up from his program, and in that moment, everything around her seemed to fade away. His eyes met hers, warm, dark brown, like rich chocolate or freshly ground coffee. There was something in them, something welcoming and genuine, and his lips curled into a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Yes, it is," he replied, his voice smooth with a subtle depth that immediately put Grace at ease. "I'm Marcus," he added, offering her a firm but gentle handshake. "Grace," she said, smiling shyly. She shook his hand, feeling an unexpected rush of warmth. His touch was steady, reassuring, as if he had done this 1,000 times, like he was used to meeting new people, used to making them feel comfortable. "What brings you here, Grace?" Marcus asked, his gaze never leaving hers, and Grace felt a flutter of surprise. It was rare to find someone so genuinely interested in her right from the start, especially in a setting like this where everyone seemed more focused on their own goals. "Well," she started, gathering her thoughts, "I'm an elementary school teacher. I've been teaching for a few years now, and I'm always looking for new strategies to create a more inclusive classroom. I believe every child deserves an equal chance to succeed, no matter where they come from. So I thought this conference would be a good opportunity to learn more about new methods and meet like-minded educators." Marcus's eyes lit up as she spoke, and she felt a surge of warmth spread through her chest. There was something so encouraging in his gaze, as though he truly cared about her words, as if he shared her passion. He nodded slowly, his lips curling into another smile. "That's incredible," he said. "I'm actually here for similar reasons. I work with a nonprofit that focuses on creating inclusive spaces for marginalized communities, especially in education. I believe we can make a real difference by breaking down the barriers that hold children back." Grace's heart fluttered at the mention of his work. She had always admired those who dedicated their lives to advocacy, to fighting for change. She had read about organizations like his, but hearing it from Marcus himself made her feel even more inspired. She could see the passion in his eyes, and the authenticity in his voice only made it stronger. "That sounds amazing," she said, almost breathless. "We need more people who care about that. So much of the education system is still so outdated and unfair." Marcus nodded again, his expression serious but not distant. "Yeah, it's tough," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "But that's why we need people who are willing to push for change, to keep fighting even when it feels like it's a losing battle. It's not easy, but every step forward counts." Grace felt an overwhelming sense of connection with him in that moment. They didn't just share similar professional goals. They shared a fundamental belief in fairness, in the idea that everyone deserved the opportunity to be seen and heard. It wasn't just about teaching. It was about making the world a better place. For a few minutes, they continued talking, delving deeper into their work and the challenges they faced. Time seemed to blur as they discussed policies, strategies, and initiatives they both cared about. The conference around them seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the magnetic pull of their conversation. When the crowd started to thin out, Grace reluctantly glanced at her watch. The afternoon workshops were about to begin, and she had promised herself she would attend one. But part of her didn't want to leave. "Well," she said with a sigh, "I guess I should get going. I'm supposed to attend a workshop in a few minutes." Marcus smiled at her warmly, as if he, too, didn't want their conversation to end. "I understand," he said, "but I'd really like to stay in touch. Maybe we could talk more over coffee sometime." Grace's heart skipped at the thought. She had barely known this man for an hour, but she already felt more understood by him than she had by many people in her life. There was a quiet confidence about him, a sense of calm that made her feel like she could be herself without fear of judgment. "I'd love that," she said, her voice almost softer than usual. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Here's my contact info," he said, handing it to her. "Let me know when you're free. I think we could have a lot to talk about." Grace took the card, her fingers brushing against his, and for a moment she felt a flutter in her stomach. She hadn't expected this kind of connection, this kind of chemistry. When she walked into the conference that morning, she had come here to learn and grow professionally, but she had found something much more profound. As they parted ways, Grace felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. She didn't know where this connection with Marcus would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of something that could change both of their lives. Growing closer. As the weeks passed, Grace found herself thinking about Marcus more often than she'd ever anticipated. Their first meeting had been a pleasant surprise, and though she'd left the conference that day with a sense of excitement, she never expected the connection between them to evolve so quickly. But it did. It started with the occasional email. First, Marcus reached out with a simple message. "I hope the workshop was useful. Would love to hear your thoughts on the session." From there, the conversation grew, slowly at first, revolving around their work, the challenges they faced in their respective fields, and their shared passion for creating more inclusive spaces in education. Their messages were thoughtful, encouraging, and surprisingly deep. One rainy afternoon, about a month after their initial meeting, Marcus suggested meeting for coffee. Grace hesitated. Her busy schedule often kept her from socializing, and she wasn't sure if her feelings for him were simply a fleeting moment of connection or something more meaningful. But something in Marcus's messages had resonated with her, something she couldn't quite put into words. She had to meet him again, to see if the spark was real. "Sure," she typed back, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "How about this weekend? There's a little cafe I love near the library." When the weekend arrived, Grace's nerves kicked in as she sat in the cafe, waiting for Marcus to arrive. She had arrived early to avoid feeling rushed, but now, with her coffee cup cradled in her hands and the weight of anticipation settling in her chest, she began to second-guess herself. What if the connection they'd shared was just a one-time thing? What if they had nothing to talk about after the initial pleasantries? She hadn't realized how much she'd come to look forward to these moments with Marcus, his thoughtful insights, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the things he cared about. Their conversations had always flowed effortlessly, but today, Grace felt the pressure to make it just as easy. And then, just as she was about to overthink it all, the door swung open, and Marcus walked in. He wore a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, and his smile, though familiar, was warmer than ever. It was as though he, too, had been waiting for this moment. "Grace," he said, his voice bright as he approached her table. "It's great to see you again." She smiled up at him, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. "I'm glad you could make it." They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes as they ordered their drinks, but soon, the conversation took a more personal turn. Marcus spoke about his work with the nonprofit, the ways in which he'd seen progress, but also the immense frustration that came with dealing with systemic issues that never seemed to change. "It feels like we're constantly pushing a boulder uphill," he said, his voice low. "I see the same problems over and over again. Inequality, lack of access, resources that are barely there, and it's exhausting, Grace. Some days, it's hard to stay motivated." Grace could hear the exhaustion in his voice, and her heart went out to him. She had always admired people like Marcus, those who took on the hard work, the tough challenges, and tried to make a difference in a world that often seemed so indifferent. But she also understood how draining it could be, how easy it was to lose hope when it felt like no one was listening. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked, her voice quiet, genuinely curious. Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes you get that one breakthrough. That one student, or that one program, or that one community event where you see a shift, a change, however small, and it makes everything worth it. But it's those moments that keep you going. Without them, it would be easy to give up." Grace nodded, deeply moved by his words. She understood the weight of what he was saying. As a teacher, she often felt that same struggle, the constant balancing act of trying to reach every student, of pouring everything she had into her work, while knowing that, at times, it would never be enough. But moments of success, those tiny victories when a student truly got it, or when a parent expressed gratitude for her efforts, made the struggle worth it. She could relate to his drive, even though their battle seemed so different. "I admire your dedication," she said after a pause, looking at him with a newfound respect. "I don't think I could do what you do. It's a different kind of strength." Marcus smiled, his eyes softening as he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know about that," he said. "Teaching is tough. You're shaping minds, shaping futures. You're doing important work too, Grace." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee. The cafe was quiet, and the rain outside tapped softly on the windows. Grace felt her shoulders relax, and for the first time in a long while, she realized how much she enjoyed this, being in this space with Marcus, discussing things that truly mattered. The more they talked, the more Grace realized how much they had in common, how deeply their values aligned. They both wanted to create a world where everyone had a fair chance, no matter their background. They both wanted to make education, and the world at large, a place where no one was left behind. Over time, these conversations became regular. They met for coffee or dinner, or even just long walks through the park when the weather was nice. It became clear that their connection was not just professional, it was personal too. They would often find themselves laughing at silly jokes, sharing stories from their childhood, and discussing the world's biggest challenges as if they were old friends. Yet, as the bond between them deepened, Grace found herself battling an undercurrent of uncertainty. While their friendship had flourished, her feelings for Marcus were growing more complex by the day. She wasn't sure if she was ready to admit it, but she was falling for him. And with those feelings came the undeniable fear of what it would mean for their relationship. She had already faced judgment from her peers in the past, and her parents had been less than thrilled when she'd started dating outside her racial and cultural background. But Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a black man, and for some people, that alone was enough to make their relationship a source of ridicule. She didn't want to let fear stand in the way of something that felt so real, but at the same time, Grace didn't know how much of that judgment she was willing to face. One evening, as they walked through a quiet part of the city after dinner, the question finally came up. "Grace," Marcus said, his voice soft, his hand brushing against hers as they strolled down the sidewalk. "I know we've been talking a lot about our work and our dreams, but I want to ask you something personal. How do you feel about us?" Grace's heart skipped a beat at his question. She had expected this moment, but now that it had arrived, she wasn't sure how to answer. She wanted to be honest, to tell him that she had feelings for him. Strong feelings, but the weight of her own doubts made her hesitate. "Marcus," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I think I'm scared." He turned to face her, concern flashing in his eyes. "Scared of what?" Grace met his gaze, her chest tightening as she spoke. "Scared of what people might think, of the judgment we might face. The last thing I want is for us to be something people talk about behind our backs. I don't know if I'm strong enough to deal with that." Marcus's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Grace, I won't pretend it'll be easy, but I promise you, love, real love, is worth fighting for. And I'll fight for us every step of the way. If you're willing to take this journey with me, we'll face whatever comes together." In that moment, Grace realized something she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She was ready to face whatever challenges might come their way, ready to let herself love Marcus, despite the doubts, despite the fear. And so, with a deep breath, she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this, Marcus, together." And so they took the first step forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges the world had in store for them. Breaking barriers. As the days turned into weeks and their connection deepened, Grace and Marcus found themselves navigating new territory, not just professionally, but personally. They had made a silent promise to each other, a commitment to be honest, to face the world together, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. But even with that promise, there were days when the world seemed to weigh heavily on their shoulders. Their work remained their anchor. Grace continued to teach, determined to make her classroom a safe space for every student who walked through the door. She fought to bring diverse voices into her lessons, creating an environment where kids felt seen, heard, and valued. She used her own experiences to guide her struggles, her triumphs, and the way her heart had expanded since meeting Marcus. Marcus, too, remained steadfast in his mission, working tirelessly at the nonprofit, advocating for systemic change. The challenges were immense, and there were days when the progress felt too slow, when the forces of institutional inertia seemed impossible to overcome. But Marcus's passion was unyielding. He believed in the power of education to transform lives, and he would stop at nothing to make that vision a reality. Still, no matter how strong they were in their respective fields, the world around them seemed determined to challenge their love. They had heard whispers, seen sideways glances, and felt the sting of disapproval from both strangers and those closest to them. But what was most painful was the way these judgments crept into the spaces they thought would be their sanctuaries. Grace's family, despite their love for her, had made their disapproval known in subtle, almost insidious ways. Her mother, though polite to Marcus when they met, would often ask Grace in private, "Do you think it's really the right time for this? People talk, Grace. You don't want to make things harder for yourself." Her father, ever the protector, would glance at Marcus with a mixture of suspicion and discomfort, making Grace wonder if he truly saw the man she had come to care for. "I just don't get it, Grace," her mother had said one evening after dinner. "You've always been so driven, so focused on your career. Why add all this complexity to your life?" "I'm not adding complexity, Mom," Grace had replied, her voice tense. "I'm adding love, the same way you did when you met Dad." But her words had fallen flat. The air in the room had thickened, and her mother's discomfort had been palpable. It wasn't the first time Grace had faced this kind of tension, but each time it cut deeper than the last. The fact that her family didn't understand, didn't see Marcus as someone who was worthy of her love, left a bitter taste in her mouth. On Marcus's side, the story wasn't much different. Though his friends and colleagues admired Grace for her intellect, her kindness, and her dedication to education, there were those who questioned his choice. They were subtle in their criticism, offering the kind of backhanded compliments that made him feel small, like he had to explain himself for falling in love with Grace. "She's an amazing woman," one of his colleagues had said, almost too eagerly. "But don't you think it's going to be hard for you? You know, with the way people can be. It could cause unnecessary complications." Marcus had smiled politely, but inside, the words stung. He didn't need their approval. He wasn't asking for it. He had made his choice, and Grace was that choice. But the quiet judgment of others, the constant reminder that their love was seen as something less than, or something wrong, was exhausting. Still, through all the silent judgments and well-meaning but painful comments, Grace and Marcus found solace in each other. They were, in many ways, each other's safe space. When the weight of the world felt unbearable, they would retreat into the world they had built together, one of laughter, warmth, and unwavering support. One night, as they sat together on Marcus's couch after dinner, the exhaustion of the day was beginning to take its toll on them both. The subtle judgments from earlier that day still lingered in Grace's mind, and Marcus could see the weariness in her eyes. "Do you ever feel like we're just too different?" Grace asked, her voice soft but steady as she rested her head against Marcus's shoulder. She had been thinking about this question for days now, wondering if their differences would ultimately create an insurmountable divide between them. Like, no matter how much we love each other, the world just won't accept it. Marcus looked down at her, his brow furrowed in thought. The question was one they both knew was inevitable, but it still felt heavy. "I think the world is always going to have something to say. It's not about whether we're different, Grace. It's about what we do with that difference. We can either let it tear us apart, or we can use it as our strength. We've already faced so much together. What's a little more noise in the background?" Grace looked up at him, her heart swelling with both love and gratitude. She had always known that Marcus was strong, that his heart was as steadfast as his mind. But hearing him speak so confidently, so resolutely, gave her the courage she had been searching for. "You're right," she said quietly, sitting up and looking him in the eyes. "We've faced more than we ever expected, and we're still here, together." It was in moments like these, when they were able to cut through the noise and just be, truly be together, that Grace understood the power of love. Not the easy kind that was romanticized in movies, but the real kind. The kind that wasn't afraid of the world's judgment, the kind that didn't give up when things got tough. It was the kind of love that had the strength to grow, no matter how hard the circumstances. And so, they kept going. They kept building, brick by brick, a life together. They had dreams, bigger ones than either of them had dared to believe possible before they met. They wanted to take their work to a larger scale, to create a program that could empower teachers, parents, and students to break free of the limitations imposed by a society that didn't always see them for who they truly were. It was an ambitious goal, but they weren't afraid to dream big. Months passed, and their collaborative work grew into something much larger than either of them had anticipated. They launched a community initiative designed to offer mentorship and resources to underserved schools in their area. The initiative became a safe haven for educators who wanted to create classrooms that were inclusive, classrooms where children of all backgrounds could feel valued. What they didn't expect was the overwhelming response. Schools, parents, and even local businesses rallied behind the initiative, offering support in ways they had never imagined. It wasn't just a program. It became a movement. And the best part, it was growing, touching lives, and making a difference in ways they couldn't have anticipated. But even with all their success, even with the fulfillment of their shared dreams, the world still wasn't ready to let them be. There were still those who questioned their relationship, still those who whispered behind their backs. But now they had something more powerful than the voices of dissent. They had each other, and they had their shared mission. "Marcus, do you think it's worth it?" Grace asked one evening as they worked late on a new project, her eyes tired but determined. "Worth it," he replied, pausing to look at her. "You're asking me if fighting for what we believe in is worth it." "Grace, we've already proven that it is." And he was right. They had proven it, time and time again. Against the odds, against the judgments, they had shown that love, in all its forms, was powerful enough to overcome the world's resistance. Together, they were unstoppable. And no matter what the world threw at them, they were ready to face it head-on. Rising above. Grace and Marcus's journey had never been easy. Each milestone was accompanied by a new challenge, a new hurdle they had to overcome. But with each trial, their love grew stronger, more resilient, and more deeply rooted. They had started as two individuals with similar dreams, but vastly different paths, each carrying their own burdens. Grace, with her quiet struggle for acceptance, and Marcus, with the weight of societal expectations pressing on his shoulders. But together, they had found strength in each other's differences, and that strength was about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. As their community initiative continued to gain traction, the ripple effects were felt far beyond the local schools they had hoped to impact. Teachers, parents, and even students from neighboring districts began reaching out, eager to learn more about their work. It seemed like the program had struck a chord, addressing the very issues that had plagued education for years, issues of equity, access, and inclusion. The success of the program, however, also attracted the attention of those who didn't share their vision. Critics, both online and in the community, began to surface. They were quiet at first, anonymous comments on social media, unmarked letters to local officials, insinuations that Grace and Marcus were too idealistic, that they didn't fully understand the complexities of the system they were trying to change. Do they really think they can change the world with a program like this? One comment read, "People like them are always looking for problems where none exist. They're going to ruin education for everyone." Grace had seen the message and was initially unsettled. The anonymous cruelty of the comment made her stomach turn, and she found herself doubting, even for a moment, whether their work was truly making a difference. But Marcus had a different perspective. He wasn't rattled by the negativity. Instead, he was resolute. People who don't believe in what we're doing will always speak louder than those who do. It's easy to tear something down, but it's much harder to build something that lasts. We've already built something that matters. That's all that matters. His words were like a balm to Grace's doubts, and as the weeks passed, she found herself leaning into his strength, his unshakable belief that what they were doing was both necessary and right. Yet it wasn't just the anonymous critics that posed a challenge. Grace and Marcus were about to face an even more personal struggle, one that would test their commitment to their mission and to each other. The invitation came on a crisp autumn day, the kind that promised change. It was an official letter from a prestigious educational conference, a gathering of the country's top thought leaders, policymakers, and educators. The letter extended an invitation to both Grace and Marcus to speak about their work, to present their initiative on a national stage. It was a huge honor, one they had dreamed about for years. The conference was the perfect platform to reach a wider audience, to inspire others to take action in the same way they had. But as soon as they shared the news with their families, Grace felt the familiar tension rise again. Her parents, though they had softened in their disapproval of her relationship with Marcus, were still reluctant to fully embrace the reality of their bond. When she told them about the invitation, her mother's smile was tight, almost forced. "That's wonderful, Grace," her mother said, her tone neutral. "But I do hope you'll be careful. You know how the world can be. It's a tough environment, especially for a woman like you." Grace's heart sank. She had expected support, perhaps even excitement, but instead, she was met with the familiar undercurrent of concern, a concern that wasn't entirely for her well-being, but for how the world would view her. Her father's reaction was no better. "I just think this is a little too much," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "You don't know how people will react. You don't know if you'll be putting yourselves in danger." Danger. Grace wasn't sure whether her father was referring to the potential backlash they might face as an interracial couple or the broader risks of standing up for change in a world that resisted it. Either way, his words stung. She had fought so hard for her own autonomy, to carve a path that was true to herself, and now she was being told to tread carefully. Again. But Marcus's response was different. His eyes gleamed with pride as he held the letter in his hands, and when he spoke, his words were firm, unyielding. "This is our moment, Grace. We've been working for this. This is our chance to show the world that love and change are powerful forces. Together, we're unstoppable." Grace could see the fire in his eyes, the passion that had first drawn her to him. His belief in their mission was unwavering, and his courage in the face of uncertainty was contagious. She wanted to be as fearless as he was. She wanted to stand beside him, not just for their program, but for their relationship, to show the world that love, in all its forms, could rise above the hate and the fear. Yet, despite Marcus's encouragement, the whispers from Grace's family still lingered, casting a shadow over her thoughts. It was one thing to face criticism from strangers. It was another to feel it from the people she loved most. She was torn between the love and respect she had for her parents and the fierce loyalty she felt toward Marcus and their shared mission. The day of the conference arrived, and Grace found herself standing before a sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, and some eager to hear what they had to say. She and Marcus had prepared for weeks, crafting their presentation, refining their message, ensuring that every word would convey their passion and purpose. But as the moment drew near, Grace's nerves returned in full force. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of expectations. Marcus stood beside her, his presence grounding her. His steady hand brushed hers, offering the kind of quiet reassurance that only he could provide. The audience fell silent as they stepped up to the podium, and for a moment, Grace felt the familiar knot in her stomach. But then, as she looked out over the crowd, she saw something unexpected. A group of educators, some of whom she recognized from the local school district, sitting at the front, nodding with anticipation. There was a sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that transcended any barriers of race or background. In that moment, Grace realized something vital. Their work, their message, was bigger than their individual struggles. It was about the students, the communities, and the future they were helping to shape. When she spoke, her voice was steady, confident, and filled with conviction. "Our mission has always been simple," she began. "To create classrooms where every child feels seen, where every teacher has the tools they need to make a difference, and where no student is left behind." But that mission didn't start with a program or a plan. It started with a belief in each other. It started with the belief that love, when shared freely, can break down barriers, change hearts, and shape the world. Marcus took over, his voice smooth but passionate as he spoke about their vision for a more inclusive educational system. "We faced adversity. We faced doubt. We've been told that what we're doing is impossible, that it's too ambitious. But we're here today to show you that it's not impossible. It's necessary. And together, we can make it happen." As they spoke, Grace could feel the energy in the room shift. What had started as skepticism slowly turned into inspiration. Their words were not just about education. They were about resilience, about fighting for what was right, about love that defied expectations. The message resonated, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was their moment, not just to present their initiative, but to share their story. And their story was one of overcoming, of proving that love, in all its forms, could change the world. When they finished, the applause was overwhelming. The room was on its feet, clapping, cheering, and calling for more. The validation they had sought for so long wasn't just in the applause. It was in the conversations that began to unfold in the hours and days that followed. Teachers, administrators, and parents approached them with ideas, support, and an eagerness to join the movement they had started. Grace and Marcus stood there, hand in hand, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished, everything they had endured. They had not only changed the narrative of what education could be, they had changed the way the world saw them. And in the process, they had changed the way they saw each other. Together, they had risen above the doubts, the judgments, and the expectations. And now, they were ready to continue building a future where love, inclusion, and education could conquer anything that stood in their way. Redefining the future. As the days passed following their groundbreaking presentation at the conference, Grace and Marcus found themselves in a whirlwind of excitement, but also of exhaustion. The initial rush of success was invigorating, but it also came with an avalanche of work and a newfound sense of responsibility. Their initiative had gained traction, and soon calls, emails, and requests for collaboration flooded their inboxes. They had touched a nerve, sparked a movement, and now it was time to take their vision to the next level. At the same time, however, they couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long, arduous journey. The praise was gratifying, but they both knew the true test was still ahead. Would the momentum continue? Could they sustain the energy and passion they had ignited, especially when faced with the inevitable obstacles that lay in their path? These were the questions that kept them up late at night, strategizing, planning, and reimagining what the future might hold. For Grace, the work was both a dream and a burden. She had always believed in the transformative power of education, and she had spent years honing her skills in the classroom. But now, as the co-founder of a rapidly expanding initiative, she had to confront a new reality. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a leader, a visionary, a change-maker. The weight of these new titles felt both exhilarating and daunting, but Marcus was there every step of the way, a steady presence that reminded her of the importance of their mission and the strength of their partnership. In the weeks following their conference presentation, they embarked on a tour, visiting schools across the country to speak with educators and administrators, gather feedback, and refine their approach. The feedback they received was overwhelmingly positive, but not without its challenges. Some schools were eager to implement the changes they were advocating for, while others were resistant, hesitant to embrace a new way of thinking. It was disheartening at times, but Grace and Marcus were undeterred. They knew they couldn't change the world in a day, but they were determined to make a difference, one classroom at a time. One of the most rewarding aspects of their growing initiative was the stories they began to hear from teachers and students. In one district, a high school teacher shared how, after attending one of their workshops, she had restructured her curriculum to include more diverse authors and perspectives, ensuring her students could see themselves reflected in the material. A middle school principal in a rural town explained how she had transformed the school's discipline policies, incorporating restorative justice practices that allowed students to take ownership of their actions and learn from their mistakes. But it wasn't just the educators who were inspired. They also received messages from parents and students, many of whom shared stories of how their lives had been impacted by the work Grace and Marcus were doing. One parent wrote to say that her child, who had struggled with learning disabilities, had finally found a teacher who understood his needs and made him feel seen. A young girl sent an email expressing how much she admired Grace and Marcus for showing that people who look different could be in love and do amazing things together. These stories filled Grace and Marcus with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they were on the right path, but the road ahead was still long. They would face resistance from those who didn't believe in their vision, and they would encounter setbacks along the way. but the outpouring of support reminded them of why they had started this journey in the first place. Still, despite the progress they were making, Grace couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was more they needed to do. As the months passed, their initiative grew, and so did their platform. But with that growth came new challenges. The backlash they had once faced on a small scale was now amplified. There were online trolls who sought to discredit their work, using their relationship as fodder for hateful comments and cruel memes. There were articles that misrepresented their program, questioning its effectiveness and accusing them of being too radical. The more successful they became, the louder the voices of dissent became. At first, the negativity stung. Grace found herself reading the comments, responding to the trolls in ways that only fueled the fire. She would get angry, frustrated, and sometimes even question whether all of this was worth it. But Marcus, as always, was her anchor. He reminded her of the bigger picture, of the lives they were changing, and of the incredible work they had already accomplished. He would tell her, "We can't control what others say, but we can control how we respond. We're doing this for the right reasons, and that's all that matters." With Marcus's support, Grace began to find a healthier way to deal with the criticism. She learned to ignore the noise, to focus on the people who truly mattered: the students, the educators, the parents, and the communities who were benefiting from their work. She became more determined than ever to push forward, knowing that every success they achieved, every life they touched, was proof that love and education could change the world. As they continued to expand their initiative, Grace and Marcus began to dream even bigger. They started talking about the possibility of opening their own school, one that would serve as a model for inclusive education, where diversity was celebrated and where every student had the tools and support they needed to thrive. It was a bold vision, but it was a vision that both of them felt deeply passionate about. They began to work on securing funding, developing partnerships, and building a team of like-minded individuals who shared their values and their goals. The process was slow and often frustrating, but with each small victory, their dream began to feel more and more within reach. They knew that creating a school wouldn't be easy. It would take years of hard work, countless hours of planning, and a great deal of sacrifice. But they were ready for the challenge. In the meantime, they continued to focus on the work they were already doing, knowing that the foundation they were building would one day lead them to the next phase of their mission. Their workshops, mentorship programs, and resources continued to reach more schools, more teachers, and more communities. They were spreading the message that education was a tool for empowerment, that every child had the right to succeed, and that love and compassion were just as important as academic achievement. One evening, as Grace and Marcus sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they found themselves reflecting on how far they had come. It had been a long road, full of challenges, heartache, and sacrifice, but they had never given up. They had proven that love, true love, was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And now they were proving that education, when approached with compassion and empathy, could change the world. "We've come a long way," Grace said softly, her voice filled with awe. "We have," Marcus agreed, his hand gently squeezing hers. "But this is just the beginning. We're not done yet." Grace smiled, her heart full of hope for the future. Together, they had already changed so much. And together, they knew they could continue to change the world. One classroom, one child, and one act of love at a time. The ultimate test. Months passed, and the weight of their dreams began to feel both heavier and more tangible. Grace and Marcus had seen their initiative grow in ways they hadn't fully anticipated, but with every new success came fresh challenges. They had reached a point where their influence was undeniable, yet that very success brought a new, unexpected dilemma. The scale of their work was expanding so rapidly that it was almost overwhelming. There were new partnerships, media appearances, and the constant pressure of maintaining the momentum they had so carefully built. Despite the whirlwind of activity around them, there was still one key piece missing: the school they had always dreamed of creating. The dream of establishing a space where their values, love, inclusion, diversity, and empathy could be woven into every aspect of education was something they couldn't shake. Yet, despite their best efforts to find a location, secure funding, and build partnerships, there were roadblocks everywhere. Regulatory challenges, bureaucratic delays, and, at times, outright opposition from some conservative educational bodies made the process far more difficult than they had ever imagined. But even in the face of setbacks, Grace and Marcus had learned how to lean into their trust in each other. They had faced their worst critics together, stood side by side as their initiative grew, and weathered the storm of public opinion. The most challenging part of their journey was not the criticism, it was the internal strain. They had seen firsthand how difficult it was to juggle a passionate mission with their personal lives, particularly when the weight of their shared dreams sometimes felt like it was too much to bear. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Grace found herself alone in their office. The walls, once filled with vibrant posters and notes of inspiration, now seemed to close in on her. She sat in front of her laptop, scrolling through emails that seemed endless. There were donors to follow up with, feedback from school districts to address, and social media messages that ranged from inspiring to discouraging. The fatigue was starting to show. Her shoulders were stiff, her mind cloudy. The pressure to succeed was suffocating, and she wondered if they were truly prepared for the weight of it all. Just as she was about to close the laptop and call it a night, the door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside, his smile warm but tinged with concern. He had been noticing the changes in Grace, the way she had withdrawn a little, the faint exhaustion in her eyes. He could tell that the optimism she had carried with her since the beginning was starting to waver. "Grace, we need to talk," he said softly, his voice not the usual confident tone he used when they were working. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made Grace look up from her laptop, startled. She sighed and closed the laptop, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Come sit. What's on your mind?" Marcus walked over, taking a seat with a quiet grace, his eyes meeting hers. "I know we've been running on adrenaline for months, but I'm starting to notice that you're burning out, and I need you to know that it's okay to take a break. You can't carry this alone. Grace, we're in this together, remember?" Grace felt the sting of his words, but she knew deep down that he was right. They had become so focused on the mission, so driven by the dream they were chasing, that they had neglected their own well-being. And she hadn't just been neglecting herself. She had been neglecting him as well. The balance that had once existed between their work and their personal lives had tipped over, and it was beginning to affect everything they held dear. "I don't want to let you down, Marcus," Grace whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want to let everyone down. There's so much to do. We're so close to building the school, but every time we get close, something falls apart. It's like we can't catch a break." Marcus reached across the desk, gently taking her hand in his. "We're doing something incredible, Grace, but the world didn't change in a day, and it won't change in a year either. We've already changed so much. We can't lose sight of how far we've come because we're too focused on what's left to do." His words were like a soothing balm to the raw edges of Grace's stress. She had always been the one to push herself to the limit, always striving to do more, to be more, and to prove that they were capable of making the impossible possible. But in that moment, she realized that she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven everything that mattered to her: her love, her commitment, and the unwavering belief that they could make a difference. But they couldn't do it alone. "I think we've been pushing ourselves too hard," she admitted, finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. "Maybe it's time to take a step back, not stop, but pause, even if only for a little while. For us, for our own sanity." Marcus smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "I think that's a good idea. But we're in this together, Grace, always." It was a simple moment, but it was one of the most significant turning points in their journey. Grace and Marcus realized that they had to take care of themselves too in order to keep their mission alive. They didn't have to sacrifice their well-being for success. True success meant balance. The work would always be there, but they couldn't let it consume them. For the first time in a long while, they made a pact to step back, to recharge, and to remember that their love and their partnership were the true foundation of everything they were doing. A few weeks later, with their heads clearer and their hearts lighter, Grace and Marcus decided to take a trip together, something they hadn't done in years. It was just the two of them, away from the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. They spent their time in a quiet coastal town, walking along the beach, sharing quiet meals, and simply being present with one another. It was the pause they both needed, a reminder of the reasons they had started this journey in the first place, because of their shared vision, their unshakable love for one another, and their belief that they could change the world together. As they sat by the shore one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Grace felt a sense of peace wash over her. The weight of the world didn't seem so heavy anymore. There was still much to do, many hurdles to jump over, but with Marcus by her side, she knew they could do anything. Together, they were unstoppable. The road to opening their school still loomed ahead, but Grace and Marcus were no longer daunted by the challenges. They had faced the toughest test of all, balancing their mission with their personal lives, and they had come out stronger for it. They were ready to face whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, no obstacle would be too great to overcome. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace turned to Marcus, her eyes full of hope and determination. "We'll build the school, Marcus. I know we will. And when we do, it will be everything we've dreamed of. But no matter how long it takes, we'll get there. Together." Marcus smiled, his hand still holding hers, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Together. And as the waves crashed against the shore, they knew that the future they were working toward, one where love, education, and inclusion were at the heart of everything, was no longer just a dream. It was within reach.